In fact, my last CD that was released, or the next to the last CD that was released, I did for Motema, and it was a 2 record set, and it had really good cats on it, and it's good. It's okay. I mean, I don't know. I can't judge my own music from that, but anyway, I got a letter, and it reminded me of something Kevin Hayes told me a few years ago too. I got an email, let me say, and it said, "Well, we have 700 copies of your CD left. About a couple of years ago, we offered you them for $2 each, and you took 50 of them or something, and then, now we're going to offer you as many as you want for free. All you have to do is pay for the shipping." So I said, "Well, I'll take 500, let you destroy 200." And I had some sent to our friend, producer Jessy Kaiser, because she's got a little more space. My house is a big place. I have a big apartment, but all the closet space and everything's pretty well taken. So, so it's like I said, "Well, what do they do, if they, with the ones that you don't buy or don't get, And so Kevin Hayes told me years ago, he said that Blue Note he had to buy his CDs because they were saying they would melt them down to make other CDs from. And I said, wow, now we can tell people that's the 3 M's of recording: mixing, mastering, and melting.
Melting. Oh my gosh. Yeah, and just imagine, that history kind of being blended in with the new whatever it's going to be, the next CD, if they make a CD. I don't know.
Well, the good point that you made was now, with people's attention span, or for whatever reason, there's a lot of streaming going on. So, when you turn into Spotify, I want to hear Warren Marsh play Melancholy Baby. So I hear Melancholy Baby. And right after that, they've chosen another thing that I haven't chosen to listen to.
Yeah.
That's along the same lines. They'll say, "Oh, here's Lee Konitz playing this," or now Lady Tristano, But you don't. The beauty of making LPs and CDs, which I thought you put very well in the interview that I listened to you speaking with Samo, yeah,
Yeah.
was the storytelling aspect you mentioned.
Right.
That when you made a CD or an LP, you heard the continuity was like a musical story.
Right.
One thing led to another, and that and that was this. But now you don't get to tell a story anymore. I mean, it's one tune to one tune.
It's very fractured. I mean, anybody who's making a recording, they're in that moment. They've created this series of tunes that are, maybe they're connected, maybe they're not so connected, but it tells the overall feeling and the moment of those compositions and that period that you're in as a creative musician, and the direction that you're going. And so nobody gets a sense of that when they're listening one tune to another, and everything's very fractured, and you don't get any credits or liner notes, because sometimes we would end up writing our own liner notes to explain what we were doing.
Yeah.
Or it could be as dry as ECM records were, but we didn't mind that because those were beautiful recordings anyway, because sometimes they didn't have any liner notes at all. But it's a different world. I don't know, I'm still trying to figure it out. And
well, I do the Wikipedia method now. If I want to know who was on a certain recording, I do the streaming on the internet, and then I say, who was the drummer on that record? And I look it up, and there it is. You go to the artist, you go to discography, and you just have to do a little more of that.
A little more digging. You go to Discogs, which is also a good resource.
Right, that's one that you get that.
Yeah, but so it's a funny world now, and and from CDs, also because of the recording industry and the process of making recordings, we went from reel to reel tape to DATS, I think. Didn't that come after? Or
yeah, I
yeah.
think so.
Well, it was actually like beta
I thought
tapes or
cassettes,
something like that.
but
Yeah.
cassettes were really the,
Well, yeah,
the first thing, you know.
yeah, cassettes. But I'm saying, you're in the studio. They're gonna first record you on 2-inch video, 2-inch tape, if you've got a big band, or if it's 1-inch tape, or
Right, right. I see on what they're
yeah.
actually recording you.
And then the next thing that they were doing, were recording you on beta tapes, and ADATs was part of that, which looked like VHS tapes. Then you had DATs. Then you had, the computer comes along, and you were starting to record right into gigabytes, I guess, or Pro Tools or whatever.
Well, didn't
Uh,
you start out as a recording engineer major?
no,
I
not,
mean, you were always playing drums from the time of
yeah.
about 10. I remember that. But didn't you do something, uh, majoring in do some recording engineering?
I'll tell you what I did. I mean, through high school, no, I had none of that. I was still trying to figure out what I was going to do later in life. But I finally ended up at the conservatory, um, by default, and I could get in there fairly easily because of my name, and my dad was the president of the conservatory, and George Russell auditioned me and said, you're okay as a Schuller, something like that. And I could swing fairly, pretty good. But my point is that during those summers at Tanglewood, which my father was still associated with, I got a gig working with the recording engineer for the Berkshire Music Center orchestra, and so I got firsthand tutoring from this guy named John Newton, who was sort of a mentor to me in that sense. A lot of common sense things about recording, and I built my own amplifier, and I knew, I learned about hanging microphones and where to place them. And this was just at the time when we had Studer reel-to-reel equipment, as well as Revox tape recorders and cassette decks to make copies for all the musicians. And just all that kind of world of recording engineer was suddenly in my lap. And that's how I kind of got used to that. And I was hired to do various concerts at Boston University. Very easy, because you just hang 2 microphones maybe for the orchestra then, and then everything's set up and you just press play.
That's what I was referring to.
Yeah,
You had some experience
play
with.
and record. Make sure you do record. But and then,
Well,
so that's, I did that for about 7 summers, from 75 to 82. Again, by the early 80s, I was getting more gigs as a musician. I was turning down a lot of gigs that were, like you'd play in Fire Island, I guess there was a gig, and I turned that down with really good musicians at that time who came out of the conservatory, because I was employed at Tanglewood. And I decided, maybe I should, give that up and start, playing as a musician. So 82 was the last summer that I was at Tanglewood. And I also, I got a few gigs up there in Stockbridge. I brought Fred Hirsch to Tanglewood to play with me. And I think Ed Felson, a great bass player, was with
I
me
remember
at
it.
one point. And I got Billy Drews to play with me early on. I don't know. I think it was a recommendation from Fred. I hadn't met Billy Drews at that point.
Yeah, they were all hanging out in New York at
And
that
my
time.
brother, of course, my brother would come to Tanglewood, and he'd bring his cats, like, Snake, JJ Harvey, and Mac Goldsberry, and who was the drummer? Not D Sharp, but it was somebody else that he was playing with. Murphy, something. His last name was Murphy. Anyway, they were hanging around, and I got to play with my brother too. Probably reluctantly, he allowed me to play with him.
Yeah.
At that point. But who else was at Tanglewood, by the way? In what was it, 79, I think, was Wynton Marsalis. And that's before he joined Art Blakey. And we became fast friends because, of course, I brought my jazz collection, my record collection, about 500 or 700 LPs that I lugged, in those boxes, and set it up on a little shelf. And he actually, he was, we were listening, we were having our own listening sessions. Of course, Winton, he was very much versed in classical music. That's why he was there. And my father was totally impressed with him. And he was kind of, he got in, he snuck in because he was underage. But my father, decided we got to get this guy. And he heard about him in New Orleans or something like that. And went and took an audition famously. And Gunther was, enamored with Winton at that time. But then we knew that he was this incredible jazz musician at that point. I played basketball with him. He took my Woody Shaw records. I think he took one Woody Shaw record that he never returned to me. Speaking of lifting something from my library. But that's the thing. And also Chuck Israels was in the area at Tanglewood. He was living in the mill in West Stockbridge. With his lovely wife at that time. And so I got to play with Chuck a little bit.
Margot.
Yeah, Margot, exactly. And there were a few other musicians hanging around in that area that I learned much later. Was it Clifford Jarvis who was up there or something like that? Some drummer that I never knew about until later, of course.
He was originally from Boston. Yeah.
And I just say, the other thing that happened at Tanglewood was that there was a scene at Alice's restaurant, and they brought up people like Sal Nistico, playing with, a local drummer named Kenny Aronoff, who became one of the great legendary rock drummers, who was at the time, he was at in the BMC orchestra studying with Vic Firth. So here's Sal Nistico playing in a small trio with Chuck, I think. And then there's also times when Abercrombie came up with Peter Donald and George Mraz, and it was a trio playing at Alice's restaurant. These were just little gigs. These guys came up from New York, and they probably went back after the gig, But that was my, entrance to those guys. I could hear those guys in the flesh, as you were talking about.
Did you go down and hang out with George and Attila was that in Vermont? Because Attila had a place.
Yes.
Near Northampton in Vermont, which also had one of those little places like Alice's restaurant called the Iron Horse.
Well, yeah. So Attila had his own jazz camp.
That's right.
In the late 80s, early 90s. They were closer to Brattleboro, I believe. Because I played with Attila at this place called the Half Moon, which was some, local bar, but they had a little space for the musicians. And that was
Don
the first.
Friedman there too?
What? Sorry?
Don Friedman, the piano player, used to come up.
I wouldn't have known about that. I didn't know him at that time, probably, because, Attila brought all his buddies up there. I don't know if Don actually taught at that camp.
He did at one point. He did, because I went up there one summer and he had his little girl with him too, which was interesting.
Right.
And Don was, but go ahead with the story. Excuse me.
Yeah. So there was a pianist named Chris Neville, and I think we both came from Boston to play with Attila, and it happened to be George Mraz playing bass. And I knew about George. I mean, I knew that he had recorded with all these incredible musicians, and there was these things he did with Tommy Flanagan, and then records with Elvin Jones,
Eclipso, and some of those, the trio of Tommy and Elvin.
And I kind of felt like, well, George is one of these really precise bass players. His feel is very exact.
Virgo.
And I was thinking, oh, I've got to play, exactly and pinpoint time, and I think I was kind of stiff that one time I played with him. But then I think as the night progressed, I felt like, well, wait a minute. I realized Elvin played with George. Elvin's not going to be pinpoint. He's going to be swinging and a motherfucker. But then I decided to loosen up a little bit, and maybe, Mraz wasn't so, disappointed that he had to play with this green jazz drummer, I wasn't so green, but anyway, the point being, here's Mraz playing with all the great drummers, and he happened to have to play with me one night. and Attila was beautiful, you know, and the two of them after the gig, oh my God, the stories, the drinking, the
Yeah,
whole bit, you know, was just
falling down
unbelievable.
laughing with these guys.
Oh, and I wish I had a microphone recording all
Yeah.
that, you know.
Well,
Yeah,
you know,
so
Abercrombie used to call Mraz. Abercrombie had every nicknames for everybody, and one of the names he'd say George Morose because
yeah,
George was
that
often depressed. He had actually George and I became pretty close for a period in there,
yeah,
and you know, I asked George why he was so well. For instance, we had this gig in Cambridge right around the time when I was about 18 as well, and it was a place called the Toga Lounge. Anyway, a drummer named Tom Marks and myself would the gig paid $30 per trio, and Tom and I would take $5 each and give a bass player 20, so we could have George or Calvin Hill, you know, or Abercrombie would sometimes play electric bass with us because he was doing that in Boston. But George, we got George, and the first time, George was astounding. I mean, as he always was.
right.
But you know, he was about maybe 7 or 8 years older than me, so he was about maybe 25, and he had just left Oscar Peterson, and he was playing amazing, but drinking with hands and feet, you know. And so he would get to a point, he would get more incoherent speaking wise as the evening progressed because he was plying himself with tremendous amount of vodka, and finally he would sit there, and he'd be at the table, and we'd say he'd be sitting there. I sat down to talk to him. This is one of our very first conversations. He'd say, I hate my bass. I hate her. I hate music. I hate you.
Oh
And,
man,
and
yeah,
he'd go on. And then we'd say, come on, George, time to play the last set. So we literally, Tom and I would prop him up, carry him to the bandstand, put him on a stool, turn his bass around, stick it in his hand, and then you stepped out of a dream, right on it, didn't miss a
right
beat.
on it. Yeah,
Everything was there. A friend of mine said, very interesting gig tonight. First time I've ever heard a bass play faster than a saxophone.
unbelievable.
And
Yeah.
you know, he was a very, in his strange way, he was supportive. You
Well,
know,
you know, because of the research I've done with some WGBH tapes, you know, there was this program called Jazz that started in '65. Actually, it started earlier with Father O'Connor, but then Herb Pomeroy was the host starting in '65. And then it eventually, you know, it turned into a program called Mixed Bag, which was more eclectic music and some jazz, but mostly independent, you know, alternative kind of rock bands of that time.
I
But there's
remember
some,
that show
yeah, yeah. Well,
because I
George
used to
Mraz
attend.
was
Yeah,
a student at Berkeley. I don't think he lasted long because he was so good. But here he is ending up playing with some of these guys. And I think even Lee ended up playing with him early on, somewhere in maybe in Europe. I'm not sure. I have to. I was just investigating that. But you know, you know, George also was subbing for Richard Davis with the
the
Thad
Santa
Jones
Mel Band.
Lewis band.
Yeah, I remember that. In fact, the show Jazz on television, I remember I used to go in the summertime to my grandparents' house in Lynn, Massachusetts. And on Channel 2, I think it was on, you know, what's now educational television, but I believe that was the station
Right.
Jazz was on. And
WGBH.
WGBH, yes, which was also the radio station. And that's the first time I ever heard of George Benson.
Right.
It was a show with Ronnie Cuber, George Benson, I believe Jimmy Lovelace, and Lonnie Smith, I think was the band.
Right.
And it prompted me, I enjoyed the show so much that I decided I went to Boston from Lynn one night to go to the jazz workshop. And Vardy had played in my dad's band. My dad had a big band, as we were talking about at one
Right.
point. But Vardy, who owned the workshop, snuck me away in there. I could sit in there And that was the first time I tried it. I said, Dad said he knew the guy, the owner. So I went in and said, tell Vardy that I'm Jimmy Mover's son. And he said, for once that worked for me. So I heard the band with George Benson and Ronnie Cuber, Lovelace, and Lonnie Smith, and they were playing for 5 people. There was nobody there because they were a brand new band. I remember Herb, I think, was the host and announced them that this is a band of the Jazz Workshop. And I never heard of this guy. He sounded great. He was singing A Foggy Day, blah, blah, blah. But, so anyway, go ahead. I do remember that show.
Yeah, well, that's what they did. They often, connected, or at least they would program these bands because they were appearing at Lenny's on the Turnpike, or at the Jazz Workshop, or at Connolly's, which was another local place where a lot of people played. And I've been building basically a roster, or at least because we have audio tapes, not necessarily video. That's the thing that's missing. And we, at that time, video was very expensive, or it was kinescopes or whatever, and they were used over, they were thrown out, who knows. But thank God there was a sound engineer who and also a lighting guy at WGBH at that time, who salvaged a lot of these things on reel to reel. So we have a lot of evidence of those programs, the audio portion of it. And there's a couple of things with George Benson, of course, and then Benson playing with, Benson sharing this show with B.B. King is one of the other programs that we have. But there's this stuff with Elvin Jones and the trio, like with Jimmy Garrison and a tenor player. No, Harold Alexander, who was kind of an obscure tenor player, who ends up playing with Elvin in a trio situation, I guess, for a year or less or something.
I didn't know that.
But, it's just this powerful trio, and sounding great. And then, there's Abby Lincoln bringing her band up, which included Cedar Walton, Cecil McVie, and Dee Jeanette, from 1965. That's who was accompanying Abby in New York. And I guess she came up because she was appearing somewhere. I forgot where. But, anyway, we got the unbelievable example of what was going on TV in the Boston area. And it wasn't just Boston either. I mean, I guess, eventually San Francisco had Ralph Gleason's program. Was doing, Jazz Casual, which was preserved. A lot of video exists of that. Before that was this program on ABC, I think, in Los Angeles as well, that we have a few video examples. And then Father O'Connor. I mean, we're wondering, where are all those tapes of Father O'Connor, who was hosting the show from 57 to 62. And we do have some audio of the Herb Pomeroy Orchestra, some of the earliest of those TV programs. Here's the Herb Pomeroy Orchestra being featured, interviewed by Father O'Connor and John McClellan, who was a radio host in the late 50s.
He's the radio host on The Interview with Bird and Paul Desmond.
Exactly, yeah.
And the following week, when Bird appears by himself, that was John McClellan, right? He was
John McClellan. He was very, very integral in the radio times of the late 50s in Boston. And they would do live broadcasts sometimes from the Hi-Hat, and also from Storyville as well. And so, so anyway, it's another whole thing with me and the archiving and checking the Boston scene out, and then going through Herb Pomeroy's archive, which is at MIT, and hearing some of the later band of Herb Pomeroy's in the early 60s, when he had Sam Rivers in the sax section. And then don't forget, Jaki Byard was in the band before that.
Right, on saxophone.
On saxophone, right.
Yeah,
but he do intermission piano. And,
right.
and you still had Ray Santisi as the regular pianist in the Herb Pomeroy band. So, it's like,
as they called him.
Yeah, Muzzy. And so anyway, there's more to that. That's
Ray Santisi ever cooked for you?
No, I did play with him, but no, I never got that.
Man, he was such a good chef.
Wow.
You know, he was a very suave guy. He never married, as I believe, but he had like he chased women like the movie Alfie. You know, I used to call him Alfie sometimes because he had
Ah,
that kind of persona. You know, like he called women birds. Yes,
oh,
we got to find some birds tonight. You know, like, there may be some nice birds at the club tonight, I think. And then he cooked me dinner one night. Man, I only ate once there, but it was incredible, man. He made this fish. He baked a fish,
yeah.
and he made a kind of white sauce on top of this haddock. I think it was a haddock or flounder or some type of white type of fish with grapes. He had
Wow.
put grapes on top of it, and
Wow.
it was great. These grapes blended with the fish with a little white wine in his sauce, and man knew what he was doing.
Man, what a great memory of a one-time dinner.
One time dinner, and then he showed me his chord changes to imagination.
Ah,
That's We're very original, and I got a little harmony lesson in that with him because he
wow.
was working with me. Actually, I'd come up to Boston and I'd get him on piano when I played at Debbie's and those clubs, and I was in my early 20s, but he would work in my band. And he brought me down to meet Art Farmer, who he was playing with the next week, and I'd be staying over in town to rest for a few days and jam with James Williams and some of my friends in Boston. And then he brought me down to meet Art, but that's a different story. But he insisted that Art hear me and stuff, which was very nice.
Well,
He was, yeah,
I felt very fortunate to at least played with Ray on a few, I would say, not the best gigs, but they were at the Boston Harbor Hotel, for instance, for some kind of corporate party. And but I did get to play with Herb Pomeroy in small group situations. Beautiful, beautiful person, beautiful player. And then also John Laporta, who was a great saxophonist himself and clarinetist, all different sort of personalities. And there were other guys like Hal Crook and John Lockwood, of course, and Garzone, Jerry Bergonzi, Bill Pierce. I felt like, wow, for those 12 years that I was on the scene in Boston, I was playing with some of the best of that area.
I had
And
a nice little group once that it actually came about by accident. I was playing at Michael's Pub, and I would either use a pianoless quartet. Well, I had or I would use guitar. So I had a pianoless quartet that I played sometimes with Hal Crook and Bobby Ward on drums and Charlie LaChapelle on bass.
wow, Charlie, oh man,
Yeah, Charlie was he was great,
he was great. Yes.
one of my buddies, and nobody played like Charlie. He was a very unusual player, and Mraz appreciated him too. By the way, he liked Charlie.
Oh, that's wonderful.
But and Mick Goodrick, sometimes I'd use Mick.
Right,
Sometimes
Mick. Yes.
sometimes I use Joe Cohn, as well. But I couldn't remember if I'd hired Mick or Hal. So the gig came up. The time comes for the gig, and they both show up. So what I did was I took what little money I would have taken for myself because we played for the door there. So if it rained, forget it. You weren't going to make anything. But if it didn't rain, you could actually have a few, make a couple of dollars. And to make everything fair, I took a couple of dollars, but not much, and gave most of my money to Hal and Mick. But anyway, that was a really nice one of those nights you remember all your life.
Right, right. Yeah. No, I mean, I don't take anything for lightly about my Boston time. It was still a growing period for me because I hadn't really hit New York. And I had gone down, I saw my brother was very much immersed in the New York scene, and he was also doing half the year he was in Berlin. And then, he got involved with Paul Motion's quintet, famously, but he had already been playing, with, of course, Lee Konitz in the early 80s. He was playing with Jaki Byard. And then he was, certainly he had a partnership with Mac Goldsberry, and he started to play with all these guys like Joe Lovano and Billy Drews, and Ratso Harris was, sometimes the second bass player, or there was Jerome Harris. So anyway, I started to get to know Gary Valente, the great trombone player, you know, and some of these people would come up, and I got to play with a lot of those cats. Other than my own generation, which came out of the New England Conservatory, and that involved these great musicians that also carved their own career out, having left Boston to go to New York, and guys like Bruce Barth, Adam Coker, you know, another great tenor player, Dave Finucane, and I'm going to probably leave out a lot of cats that I had, you know,
Well,
that we
I wrote
started off
down
with.
some of them, you
Yeah,
know, because I was amazed that how few of them, and I must say I haven't really been listening so much to that younger generation. And you know, you mentioned some names, and
yeah.
some names I said, wow, I don't know that many of these cats. But among the people you mentioned who played with, you know, you could talk about your Orange and
Orange
then
and Blue, right,
and also the band you had called the Show Dogs
right.
with your brother, you know, and you know, but some of the cats that you mentioned, the guys I knew were people like Chris Speed, Dave Douglas, Bruce Barth, but then Andy
Andy Laster,
Laster,
right.
Laster. Um, then you mentioned people. Well, you had a band with Ed and Garzone and Tony Malaby, Herb Robertson, um,
Rich Perry,
Rich Perry, which I was going to say is just a wonderful, you know,
beautiful.
tenor player.
Yeah.
Very, I mean, you could truly say people aren't hip to how great he plays. Um, there's one guy too I was going to ask you about that I really like from I think that generation, and I haven't heard about him for a while. But Chris Cheek,
Oh, right. Yeah. Oh, God. Yes. And
I think he's a
I
monster. This guy is beautiful.
I started playing with him. I had a sort of a connection up in Portland, Maine, through Ben Street, the great bass player, and because his family came from Portland, and there was a club up there called Cafe No, that was run by unbelievably great, uh, you know, owner of that club or that bar. Well, it's a club. They serve food. His name is Paul Lichter, and he also still programs jazz up in that area. But we got a chance to play for 3 years up there because of Ben Street, and I got to play with all sorts of cats. But Chris Cheek was very young, and he was one of these tenor players that I think he went to Berkeley, something like that. In any case, I got to play with him as well as Kurt Rosenwinkel, who was, you know, he was like 19 years old and just blowing us away with his amazing playing. And
Yeah,
you
he's a
know,
big player too.
yeah, so my opportunities, you know, were growing to playing with those guys and going up to Portland to play up there, and you'd play 1 or 2 nights. Paul would put you up and he'd feed you, and it was just a wonderful,
Oh,
warm environment. And that's where I got to play with Lee Konitz for the first time, because I had the courage to ask Lee to you know, would you play with me, and we'll have Bruce Gertz play bass, the great bass player and teacher at Berkeley. And this was going to be because Lee was coming up with his own group, which included Peggy Stern and Ben Allison and Jeff Williams. And they were playing at, I think it was Scullers for the weekend. So I got Lee to play the Thursday, you know, up in Portland. And then, you know, as a
down
bookend,
to Boston.
I got him to play down in Providence at a place called AS 220, and that was that Sunday. So it was, you know, Lee playing trio with me. Then he had his own group playing Friday and Saturday at Scullers, and then Sunday he ended up with me again, and that was in 1992. And you know, who knows? I had no idea that I'd be playing with him again, you know, 10 years or 15 years later. But that was the first time that because, you know, I was enamored with Lee, and of course the no net was the thing that really was an inspiration for my group called Orange Then Blue, which was a 11-piece, 12-piece band. But we kind of modeled ourselves not only because of Charles Mingus and Gil Evans and all that, and Duke and all that, but because of Lee Konitz and Nonette, at least from my perspective, because I love that group, the combination of the soprano and the baritone and the colors that were coming from that band with all those great players and the smallness of it, as well as the largeness because of the orchestration and Cy Johnson's arrangements, which were
I
beautiful.
Johnson's great is great, great.
Yeah. So anyway, that was my entrance to Lee at that time. And, we borrowed that chart Matrix, which was a
The Korea
beautiful,
tune.
the Chicoria tune, which is a blues, but there's
Right.
this soli section that Cy Johnson arranged of Chick's original solo from the trio record with Miroslav and Roy Haynes. And so that was one of our first charts.
Now he sings, now he sobs, which is if you're looking for
Yes,
that.
right. So
Classic.
Matrix was one of our first charts that we used in the band. And we showed off Roy Okutani, who was my wonderful lead trumpet player in that band. He could play piccolo trumpet. And so we said, well, that's a natural. So, we covered all the bases of that particular arrangement. And I went down to get that chart from Cy Johnson, who allowed me, to make a copy.
Yeah.
And so that was really the beginnings of my association with Lee Konitz.
There used to be a wonderful little restaurant. It was like a Greek tavern restaurant, Charlie's.
Yes.
And they had lamb chops. Man, they gave you about 8 lamb chops that were like huge. And you could eat very well with that Greek salad and the roasted potatoes. I'll tell you, I'm trying to find another place like that.
Was that in Central Square?
Central Square. I believe it was Central Square.
So it's called Charlie's Tap?
Charlie's Tap. I think so.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
There used to be music there.
And it was very reasonable. When I was there, there was no music. Probably it was a good place for music. It would have been. I could see where one could do that. But when I was there, it was just lamb chops. They had other things.
Yeah.
But I remember that was a favorite haunt.
That was one of the few places where I played with Jaki Byard and John Neves.
Now
2 nights.
When you mentioned Jaki Byard and John Neves, I remember in one interview that I was listening to you, you said one of your regrets was you didn't get closer to Jaki. Or, I have a certain regret about Herb Pomeroy that way too, because, we both taught at Berkeley. He taught at Berkeley forever, and I taught 3 semesters at Berkeley before Chet Baker called me to go back on the road with him. And I left and went to Europe with Chet. But, I had ample opportunity to get to know Herb, and I just never, kind of took advantage of that. So I do kind of regret that. So you worked the one gig with Jaki.
Yeah, I got to play with Jaki. Well, for the first time I got to play with Jaki, I was thrown into the Apollo Stompers at Michael's, while I was at the conservatory as a student, filling in for John Hazilla. And that was a frightening experience because, the book, I probably, I couldn't decipher whatever was on the page for the drum parts. But I had to learn, I probably had to learn Moon Train, by listening to it. Certainly I saw the band a few times at Michael's. It was right down the street from the conservatory. But that was really literally the first time. And then I got to play with Jaki at Charlie's Tap for those 2 nights. And then my brother and I got to play with Jaki in Fargo, North Dakota, of all things, which is my mother's hometown.
And how does that come about?
Yeah, that was a concert in 1995 because we were also going to Bismarck. Jaki had an annual February concert in Bismarck, North Dakota, called the Bismarck Jazz Celebration for 10 years, I think. And it's because this guy, Chuck Florence, and also another guy who organized the concert, John something, I believe, was always hiring Jaki to come there. And then Jaki would say, oh yeah, I got a gig in Duluth. These are the coldest places on earth. Why was he doing that? I don't know. But
the winter.
Yeah. So the gig, that particular gig in Bismarck was a quintet. It was with this saxophone player from Montana named Chuck Florence, and Joe Lovano was the guest on tenor. And it was Jaki, my brother, and myself. and there's a video of that particular concert. Um,
Uh-uh.
we tried to record with Jaki as a quartet without Joe Lovano the next day, I believe, and you know it was impossible because Jaki refused to wear headphones, and he was in a booth, you know, with a piano, and I was in a booth, and my brother, you know, so we tried to you know, my brother and I were trying to hook up with Jackie's time, which could be loose at times, you know.
Yeah.
Um and Jackie couldn't hear us. You know, it was an impossible situation. So like we're trying to like chase him, you know, and trying to keep it together. And yeah, I think we recorded 4 tunes, and then Jackie just sort of said, I can't do this anymore, and he gave up. And it
But
was
that's weird.
unfortunate.
He'd done so many records in other circumstances. I wonder why he had that particularly.
He
I mean,
might have not been in the best frame of mind. It wasn't the best circumstance for him. And it was too bad because we're still looking for that recording. I think that that guy who organized it still has it. You know, I'd like to hear it. Maybe there is something to that. And Jackie was into I think it was the theme to the Muppets show. For some reason he loved that tune. So we played that. It's like a tune in three. Um
uh-huh.
something with rainbow in the title or something like that.
Rainbow Connection.
Yes,
Someday I'll
Rainbow
find it.
Connection.
Rainbow Connection. The lovers, the dreamers, and me. I played
Yes,
that with him. It's just another song about rainbows. Yeah, I actually played that with him.
right, right. You know,
And
so anyway, but
it's nice too.
the concert we did in Fargo was very moving because it was to honor my mother who had passed a few years earlier, and all my cousins were there. I mean, I got 50 cousins, and you know, and nieces and nephews, and or you know, second
What was your
cousins or whatever
mother's
you call them.
ethnic background? What was your mother's ethnic background? I know that Gunther was basically from German or
Background,
Austrian.
yeah. My mother was basically sort of Irish Scottish. You know, they came from Montana, you know, via whatever Kentucky or I don't know. I forgot the whole lineage, but my grandfather was a in the clothing business, and he had a huge department store called Black's. My grandfather was named George Black, and so this department store was the tallest building in Fargo at one point, Black's department store, or it's just called Black's. And so, you know, my mother, you know, grew up in this household that was very religious, and you know,
Like
she suddenly
evangelical.
meets this guy from New York at in Cincinnati because they were both at the Cincinnati Conservatory. That's, you know, my dad.
She was an opera singer or a classical pianist or
Yes, she was first a classical pianist, but also she was trying to be a vocalist in doing arias, not necessarily trying to be an opera singer, but she was doing arias from Verdi and you know various Mozart and things like that. And and she was learning that trade as well as being an accomplished concert pianist. And she didn't quite achieve that because her vocal teacher at the time kind of ruined her voice the way that the training was. And so she had to drop that eventually, and she dropped really music because she eventually had to take care of my brother and I, you know,
right.
and my dad, who was, you know, he was the serious, you know, he was going to go all the way as a musician. So they met, you know, in the 43, 44. That's when my parents met each other at in Cincinnati at the Cincinnati Conservatory. But
During
you
World War II.
but you can imagine my grandparents were very conservative and, you know, religious, and here's this upstart from New York suddenly sweeping away one of their daughters. And you know, it was a bit of a hardship for my mom to come from Fargo to go straight to New York City. Although, you know, the Cincinnati period was a period of where my dad was sort of, you know, kind of introducing her to maybe jazz things, and also all this avant-garde contemporary classical music, you know, Berg, Webern, Schoenberg, Stravinsky, Bartok, you know, things like that.
Henry
So
Cowell.
and you know, there was this great Um,
Oh,
uh,
right.
Pianist Edward Steuerman, who my mother was studying with, who also loved my dad because he played French horn, and so they played the Brahms horn trio. And that was one of my father's favorite pieces to play, because this piano, horn, and violin, an interesting sort of chamber combination. Um, my father had a whole, mission and manifesto that he wrote about the Brahms horn trio
Really?
much later. Oh yeah, because he felt like all the publications didn't do Brahms justice the way it should have been played, and he thought that everybody who played that piece played it wrong because of the publications, the editions that came out. So he was ready to sort of write the way that it should be, to correct it.
To renotate it, kind of.
Yeah, but you're not completely, he's not
Not
changing
completely.
notes,
No,
but
not changed, but
he's adding dynamics, and he's
that's what I
trying to
mean.
figure out, because of the layering and the instrumentation, you had to have French horn somehow come down at certain points because it's a loud instrument, and allow the piano and the violin to come up, those kind of dynamics.
I mean, the French horn can be the elephant in the room.
Exactly. And
You know,
so he got Rick Todd, Joel Smirnoff, and Christopher O'Reilly to finally do what he thought was the definitive version of Brahms Horn Trio, which we are trying to sell on GM Recordings, that's the label I kind of took over from my dad. And it's sort of a headache these days. But
GM was kind of a homemade label. Was this the?
it started in '81, and it started with Bob DiDomenico's music. That was our first recording, a double LP in 1981. By the early 80s, we also added the jazz recordings, and my brother recorded with Tom McKinley, and that was the first jazz recording.
I remember him, the pianist and arranger from New England Conservatory.
Yeah, and he was also into classical music, and
Right.
he suddenly got into minimalism as well. But he was teaching at the conservatory, and I got to play with Tom McKinley because he was our Kenny Kirkland at that time, because he was the guy who could play like that, in the Boston area.
Yeah, I played with him too a little bit. Yeah.
Right. He'd be a monster on the piano. Maybe sometimes a little too much, for me as this kind of green jazz drummer trying to keep up with. And I got to play with Tom McKinley and Miroslav Vitus for about 3 or 4 nights at Sandy's. I don't know if you remember that place.
I played a lot at Sandy's.
Right, and Beverly.
I brought Chet Baker to play at Sandy's, and I did a very nice 3 alto gig one time with, I believe the rhythm section was Terry Lynn Carrington when she was about 18,
Right.
17. Gray Sargent, and I think the bass player was Marshall Wood.
Right.
And the 3 horns were Dick Johnson, Jimmy Mosher, and me.
Wow. All playing alto. All playing
alto. It was sort of an alto band. And it was recorded by somebody who had a new recording technique or something. And somewhere that recording exists. And I'd love to hear it someday, but I don't know where it is.
Is that the guy that was rooming with Lee Konitz in the 90s? I'm forgetting his name, but he was sort of subletting Lee's apartment when Lee was on tour for many months.
Not the guy that was married to the girl from Kim Cattrall.
Yes.
Right, he was a bass player, I think. No, it wasn't him, but I remember that Lee had sublet his apartment to this guy. No, it was somebody in the Boston area who had this interesting way of recording. It was sort of like more than stereo. Unfortunately, I'm not so familiar with the terms quadraphonic.
Yeah.
But anyway, there was, and Sandy died before I could really get in touch with him about where that tape was, and there's really nobody around anymore. It's one of those things you can, like the Holy Grail, to search for. You
never know. It kind of pops up in various places. I could look into that, see if there were a few guys that did that at that time. I have to look for their names. By the way, the guy's name was Mark Levinson.
Mark Levinson, that's right.
Yeah, and he's in Venice these days. I've been trying to get in touch with him here and there.
Venice, Italy, as opposed to Venice, California.
Yeah, no, Venice, Italy. Yeah.
The original Venice. Okay.
But he recorded the Herb Pomeroy band, for instance. Um, I think, was it at Sandy's or was it at, it was the El Morocco in Worcester. And he put this record out, but it was on one of those CDs that are blue. I don't know what they're called, the Blu-ray or something like that, Blu-ray CDs, which you can't play on normal CD players, right? So I bought the CD just to say, okay, I have it. Then I found the actual recording in Herb Pomeroy's archive. So I need to get in touch with Mark because, of course, he's got this association not only of that because he was into all that new fangled recording technique with the one microphone and all that bit, but also because of his association with Lee, and he recorded Lee in various occasions. A lot of this never came out, but I have, Lee ended up with a lot of these recordings. There's a duo thing with Tommy Flanagan that
Oh man, I'd love to hear that.
that we've never, nobody's ever heard. There's other stuff with Max Roach coming into play with Lee and no bass player. And I think it's even, and then oh, okay, but besides that, there's Mark Levinson and his association with Paul Bley, in the late '60s, and because he was he was kind of a free bass player,
Right.
and it was Barry Altschul who was playing drums, so
Okay.
God damn, this guy has got to, I'd love to just find out about his story, and all his recordings are in storage somewhere in New Jersey. And I can't imagine what's going on with those. They're probably decaying or something. I don't know. I hope they're okay.
Somebody should
But,
reach him, yeah, and find
well,
out.
he said he would try to come back at some point and let me know, but it's now been at least 2 years since I've been that I talked to him. I did probably a little Zoom with him,
Well,
but I need to get his story anyway.
getting back to Lee, so and your archival work, among other things, that we haven't covered too much is George as a composer and arranger. We did talk a little bit about the band that he had for quite a while and that did quite a few tours of Europe, the Orange and
Orange and
Blue,
Blue.
and named after Mingus's tune, "Orange was the color of her dress," then Blue Silk, but not Silk Blue. I guess I can tell that story a little bit. They said, I mean, it was dedicated to Billie Holiday, which it may have been because there is a feeling of that in it. And I think Mingus wasn't talking about Billie when he referred to it one night when I was on the band. He said, kind of halfway under his breath, he said, "Now we like to play Orange was the color of her dress, then Blue Silk were her drawers." And, that was how he described that song. So, but anyway, that was a band, and you made several records with that band that can be obtained on a couple of different labels. If you want to check out that the band, which was sort of like a large big band, a 12-piece nonette.
Yeah, that's a good way to describe it. Yeah, because we didn't want to be a full, 5 saxes, 4 trumpets, or 4 trombones. We wanted something that was fairly easy to manage, economically, whatever, even for rehearsals. Rehearsals were a struggle, though. I always remember, man, if you had one guy missing, that always was a pain in the ass. And then you try to get somebody to sub, or you don't, and you couldn't hear everything that you were writing and whatever. But we managed. We stuck with it for 13 years. We started in Boston.
That's a long run, man. That's a long run.
Well, basically, because we started as a cooperative band and everybody had their role. Basically, we were all writing and trying out new things and charts. And but then eventually it came down to me to sort of, find the gigs, promote the gigs, get the rehearsals together, call everybody. This is way before emails and whatever.
I did a lot of that too. That
right.
was,
Yeah.
you had to be, Paul Bley said to me, you have to call people at 11 o'clock in the morning. He said 11 a.m., whatever part of the world they're in, agents are going to be in their office at that hour. Bley also taught me that there are two people in every country. Sometimes there's three or four, but if you know the two people that are the main bookers for each country, and you become friendly with them, he said, then you can keep your career going for a long time. And so I was faithfully up. Even if I'd been to sleep, I woke up. If I hadn't been to bed, which was most often the case, it was at 5 o'clock in the morning, which is 6 o'clock in most European countries, or at least Central Europe. I was there, and I would have to be sober. And at 5 o'clock my time, I would call Europe and say what's happening with January and blah blah blah, and get the right information, and then adjust.
Well, it was a bit of a cumbersome situation, but we managed to get gigs around New England, of course, and then I eventually got the courage to try to book the band, in the Midwest, and we'd fly out there to Chicago, rent a couple vans, and travel around to some universities that had good music programs and things like that. We actually played at Columbia College. Was it Columbia College in Chicago? And Bill Russo was still around, and he was teaching there. I don't think he was too enamored with we were starting to stretch with our arrangements and playing some sort of bizarre tunes, and I don't know if he liked our band, but that's okay. Anyway, it was nice to meet him at that point. This is way before I got to know about all this other stuff, about the School of Jazz and all that kind of thing.
Well, there's no touring grants, unfortunately, like we were talking about. You were talking about that.
Yes.
That other interview, in other countries, like Switzerland, they practically do everything but play the music for you.
Yes.
I mean, you get money to tour, you get money for your hotels, and make sure you're paid. In Belgium, a friend of mine was telling me, if you work a certain amount of gigs a year, I think if you do like 50 gigs a year, then you get money for even the days that you don't work.
It's amazing. Yeah.
It's like $50 a day or $75 a day for the rest of the year, whether you work or not.
Yeah, I learned about that because I thought, there were these great European big bands that would come to the States, and they play at the Cordova Museum in Lexington, and sorry, in Lincoln. And I get to see Django Bates' delightful Precipice, but they're getting subsidized. They're being financed by their governments, the Dutch government. There are these other bands, like oh man, my memory of these guys. William Breuker Collectif, they'd show up at 1369, and they take up the whole stage, but they were doing a tour that was all subsidized. And so, I felt like, God, why can't, Orange and Blue get that same sort of treatment when we go to Europe or whatever, or go to around this in the States? But yeah, it was a struggle. There was the Lila Wallace Reader's Digest grants that you could play at these venues around the United States. And we got an opportunity to play sort of like in Dayton, Ohio, for instance. We also played up in Burlington, Vermont, and because they had this money from the Lila Wallace folks, to present concerts.
Right.
But generally, a lot of those places use money to get the McCoy Tyners and and maybe the other groups that were more known. Sonny Rollins, maybe not Sonny Rollins because he probably demanded a lot of money, but you know what I mean. So
it's sort of like there's no more middle class,
right,
in jazz employment.
Right.
Either you're, because I was always, I think sort of like that. Even Lee Konitz for a long time was in that category. Yes. Of artists, and I knew Lee in pretty dry spells, as well as which even he seems to have forgotten that time, or just didn't want to talk about it. But when you were there with him, you remembered that it wasn't easy for him, and that's because the money of the main money of the festival was going to the big stars, and that got more and more uh, so as the years progressed, and economics became a little bit different. And then the other, what was left, was for the local cats, because they would have the local people or the people that lived in the vicinity and didn't want that. So at one point, there was a whole big market for people like Lee Konitz, Art Farmer, even people like there were house rhythm sections, or not, or let's say good rhythm sections in each country that were organized by, for instance, there was a bass player in Belgium named Roger van Haverbeck, and Roger had a whole stable of cats that he would bring over, and he would organize a rhythm section, and he would have Sal Nistico, Johnny Griffin, Clark Terry, um, Phil Woods at one point, maybe Phil, I'm not sure. I was part of that too. I would, once or twice a year, I'd do my Belgium with Roger. He wasn't the world's greatest bass player, but the gigs were righteous and everything was decent. But, it wasn't, it still was a long way between that and what Oscar Peterson made.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Kind of, so.
But there were enough, there were these places where they kind of realized, oh, we're trying to do something a little bit different in this large ensemble context. And I think they appreciated that. Although, again, it was a struggle. We did one tour in the Middle East that was sponsored by the State Department, and it was a 7-piece version of Orange Then Blue. So we called it Orange Then Light Blue. Yeah, and that involved Chris Speed, Matt Dario, who was one of the original members of Orange Then Blue, and Ben Street was on bass, and Tim Ray, the pianist, and Mark Taylor, the French horn player, and Dave Ballou on trumpet. And we're playing in Syria, we're playing in Cyprus, and in Turkey, and that was a 3-week tour. It was a really eye-opening experience to be playing our music for these audiences that probably hadn't heard anything like that, and we would give them free cassettes. That's what they were into at that time, cassettes. And we had to make cassettes of our first album. I remember, the whole rush to get that done. Otherwise, if you're giving them CDs, they can't play it because they didn't have CD players over there at that point. Certainly not in those far off cities. So anyway, we also did a tour in Berlin and Nijmegen, the Netherlands, a town in Netherlands, and the few opportunities that we toured took a toll on my credit card, situation. And after 13 years, I kind of sort of said, I can't do this anymore. And at that time, I had moved down to New York. The band was fully a New York band. And I was starting to do my small groups, which included the Shul Dogs, and also another band that I had called Chump Change, which I decided to, I was urged to change the name of that band, because if we were going to play festivals, were we going to accept Chump Change for that band? No, we wanted to, step
put
up.
the wrong idea.
It was a kind of, that's a kind of a blues. There was a blues band, actually, I think in Texas, called Chump Change. In any case, Ingrid Jensen was the one who said, you know what, maybe you should change the name. And I did. I changed it to Circle Wide, which I guess gives you a sort of a abstract, expansive nature of that band. That was with Donnie McCaslin and Ingrid Jensen and Tom Beckham and Dave Ambrosio. And I play with some of these guys to this day. Shul Dogs, yeah, that was a different beast, because that was with my brother. And it was supposed to be a 2-tenor bass and drum kind of situation. And we started with George Garzone and Tony Malaby, which was fantastic. And then we did a tour with Tony Malaby and Tim Byrne. And John Hebert replaced my brother, because my brother was busy with his own bands.
Well,
So, there were a lot of great opportunities to do this open kind of music. And it connected me to other bands of that nature, like Conference Call with Michael Jeffrey Stevens, Gepard Ullman, and Joe Fonda. And
Michael Jeffrey Stevens and I went to high school together, actually.
oh, did you really? Wow.
Miami, yeah.
Yeah.
But let's move on to the archival thing a little bit.
Yeah.
So, George, you've made a couple of beautiful movies, which you sent me, and I got to look at these films. They're both about 90 minutes long, and one is specifically on the jazz school in Lenox at the Music Barn that was started out in the early 50s and then became a full-blown school or summer program, the very first place where somebody could go and study jazz. And a lot of illustrious musicians were there as teachers, but also many illustrious, very gifted people who became quite well known were students, including Ornette Coleman and Don Cherry. So this was really started by your father and John Lewis, as I understand. And maybe you could take us through what this wonderful film is about.
Well, yeah, it's a little bit of a complicated story because the origins of it were something that I didn't know about when I got involved with that first film, which was called Music In, and we were going to pretty much feature the surviving owner of Music In, Stephanie Barber, and she was in her around 83 years old when we started interviewing her. But before that, I had gotten interested in the School of Jazz because of these recordings, these special recordings that were made. They are LPs that were given to the students and the faculty of the particular concerts that they ended up playing at the end of the summer session. The School of Jazz occurred basically in 3 weeks of consecutive years between 57 and 60 in the month of August. And this happened to have the location of the Music In and where this was taking place was in Lenox, Massachusetts. And it was right next door to Tanglewood, and which is the summer home of the Boston Symphony.
Right.
So here's this experiment, basically, because John Lewis was really the guy that thought of this, along with the Barbers, who supported the whole idea of starting a summer camp of some kind. Now,
his name was Philip Barber, but not Philip Barber, the composer.
No, yeah, or Samuel Barber is what you're thinking of, right?
I'm sorry, Samuel Barber. Right.
Yeah, Philip Barber and Stephanie Barber, who were New York. They were. Stephanie was in the fashion business, and Philip was in the theater business, and also Stephanie was sort of, they were promoters of the New York scene, and so they bought this land up at Lenox area, about 100 acres, and these barns in 1950. And they wanted to establish a sort of a place for their friends from New York to come up. But at the same time, they thought, well, maybe we could have guests, regular guests at this inn. And they decided to start these little programs, these music presentations. And it started with Alan Lomax bringing, Pete Seeger and who am I forgetting? Oh yeah, of course, Woody Guthrie. Woody Guthrie,
right?
Yeah, on guitar and fiddle, and so there were these presentations. Alan Lomax also brought his recordings of these field recordings, that he had famously done down in the South. And they would play him on this incredible, one of a kind speaker system, that was sort of developed at that time. 78s, these were 78s. Anyway, that grew into a thing where Marshall Stearns heard about this, and then Marshall brought his his colleagues, these professors, these linguists, these archaeologists, and also other musicologists who were studying, music in Latin America and in and parts of the Caribbean. And Marshall wanted to make these connections about jazz and all the other musics. And because Marshall was very interested in where jazz was coming from, Africa, of course, but what were the linkages, what were the connections? And so he had these roundtables, and they started in the summer of '51. And then he brought UB Blake up there, and he brought Tony Scott up there, and he got Mahalia Jackson to come, because of Langston Hughes recommending that Mahalia should, be there. And then, Dick Katz was there in that very beginning period, playing with guys like Rex Stewart and then
Dick Katz was like Zelig.
Yeah.
Something was happening. Dick was there.
Exactly. So there were these roundtables. They're very loose, but they got sort of formalized, and they were recorded on reel-to-reel tapes, and these tapes ended up at the Institute of Jazz Studies at Rutgers, because that's where Marshall Stearns eventually developed the Institute of Jazz Studies, first in his home on Weverly Place, but then it was moved over to Rutgers University in the Dana Library. So these roundtables happened for a few years. Then they started having these concerts in the Music Barn, bringing up people in a more formal situation, all sorts of types of music. It not only was traditional jazz, or it could have been the small vestiges of modern jazz, but it was also folk music and Caribbean music. And so by 1955, they finally built a barn, an actual stage, and they got the Count Basie band to come up there, and the Duke Ellington's band, and Louis Armstrong, and then Thelonious Monk with his group, and who else? Art Farmer, Gigi Grice, Coleman
Randy
Hawkins.
Weston.
Huh? Randy Weston. Well, Randy was in the area already, because he was the short order cook, who was
That's
sort
a
of
funny story in there.
Yeah, he was kind of doing his thing at a different venue, which was a sort of there were all these inns and from the golden age, and these were railroad tycoons who left huge mansions in the Berkshires. And so Randy was somewhere else. He heard that there was this thing going on at the Music Inn, and he came, and he tells a story about going through the woods, and there's Marshall Stearns talking about Africa, and he's like, "Oh my God, I gotta be a part of this." Interestingly enough, Randy really never did any formal concerts at Music Inn, which is kind of surprising to me, but he did play in the area at a place called which I think it was Avaloq. It was called the Avaloq Inn, which was just down the road from Music Inn, and he brought his cats like Cecil Payne and
the Brooklyn guys,
and Willie Smith was the drummer at that time, and so, and also Sam
Willie.
I'm forgetting Sam.
Played with Willie Jones.
I'm sorry, Willie Jones. Yes,
Willie Jones.
Willie Jones. Yes,
yeah.
Not Willie Smith, the alto player, right? Yeah.
Right, but Willie Jones, who's
okay.
Yeah.
So anyway, Randy was part of the scene as well, and he remembers those occasions. Also seeing Monk, come up at that time, playing at that in the barn. Eventually, there was this huge roundtable, 1 week long, with different subjects, and they had Sonny Rollins and Dizzy Gillespie and Leonard Feather and Willis Conover and Nat Hentoff, and it's just this a confluence of like-minded jazz folks who were trying to discuss, rhythm and harmony and the influences of jazz and the recording industry. This happened for a week. Then they had a big historic concert at the end with sort of the pairing up of the moldy figs, so-called moldy figs, with the traditionalists with the modern bebop guys. And it was Nat Hentoff and the great writer of jazz. I'm sorry, some of this is all slipping my mind these days. But it was their idea to bring everybody together, to play together, like Jimmy Giuffre and Pee Wee Russell, which was a famous kind of pairing, because here's Jimmy, sort of the modern jazz guy.
Clarinetist, right?
Yeah, and Pee Wee Russell, who could play monk tunes, by the way.
They did do a record together.
Right. And this, so that particular occasion in 1956, with all the roundtable discussion, then the seeds of the School of Jazz was suddenly introduced, and John Lewis, along with the Barbers, and also a few other people, felt like, okay, we got to start a School of Jazz, and it would be a student body, not so large, that would be fitted along with these teachers. And some of these teachers never taught before, by the way, so they're kind of thrown in the fire. And it would be small
Bill
enough.
Evans is the only time he ever taught.
Right. And then Bill Evans eventually got there by 1959. But it started with Dizzy and Oscar Peterson and Ray Brown and Herb Ellis and the Modern Jazz Quartet, of course, John Lewis, Milt Jackson, Connie Kay, and Percy Heath, and Jimmy Giuffre's trio, which was Ralph Pena and Jim Hall. And the student body wasn't that large, so it was all very small group stuff. And so everybody had their small group. It was about 5 or 6 different little ensembles. And I don't think this was taking place at any time before that, because mostly there was the Stan Kenton School, those camps, which were really about the big bands. But I think this was a novel idea, and John Lewis had discussions with Gunther about putting this together, but it was really John Lewis's baby. And Gunther didn't get involved in really, as a faculty member until 1959. So the first year of the School of Jazz was 57. The student body was very small, but dedicated, and it was a lot of pianists because Oscar Peterson was there. So a lot of people wanted to study with Oscar. And then eventually, by 58, it even grew a little more. 59 is when we had Ornette Coleman and Don Cherry there, because Percy Heath was the one who said to John Lewis, you got to hear these guys. And they were in the Los Angeles scene. And somehow they managed to get Ornette and Don east to Lenox. It's sort of the first time that both of them were there, even before they got to New York. And then the word got around, and Nesui Erdogan found out, and Atlantic Records signed them up right away, kind of stole them from Contemporary Records. And then the whole hoopla of those two guys there, they kind of changed the whole vibe of the School of Jazz, because a lot of people were following Horace Silver and Sonny Rollins and Miles Davis. Those were the examples that all these students wanted to play like those guys.
Right. Even the teachers were a bit divided about them too, because I think that, for instance,
exactly,
Bob Brookmeyer was not a fan.
Well, that was part of the problem here, is that Ornette and Don unknowingly kind of divided the camp. And, you had Dave Baker, who was a student there, and he said, oh man, we thought we were the Cats because we arrived from, Indianapolis, and, because we were with Freddie Hubbard and we knew about Wes Montgomery, but here, it's Larry Ridley and Dave Baker and David Young and these young brash guys, playing beboppy type things, but on the edge a little bit. But here's Ornette and Don Cherry, totally opposite, kind of screwing them up, with all this intention that was given to Ornette and Don Cherry. And Gunther was behind the whole thing with Ornette. So was Martin Williams. So was Nat Hentoff. Everybody was like suddenly, oh my God, who are these two guys? Well, especially Ornette. I mean, Don was, the sort of he was Ornette's side person. He was going to protect Ornette. He was going to sort of validate Ornette because Ornette was maybe unable to explain what he was trying to do. And Don was sort of the guy who knew about Western harmony and knew how to explain what Ornette was trying to do with all these funny lead sheets that Ornette was writing. So
well, the converse opinion of Ornette, and I like Ornette, but I mean, listening to people at Jim and Andy's years ago when that was still a hot topic, even in the mid '60s, people were still arguing about Ornette and the validity or lack of it. And like one of the more conservative opinions about Ornette was that the critics were afraid because they'd missed Bird. A lot of them had kind of dismissed Charlie Parker, and they didn't want to do it twice. They were afraid of that they might be wrong.
right.
So they touted Ornette, perhaps overly touted him, in compensation for having missed Bird, which is
it's so we gotta figure that this was 4 years after Bird had passed, right? So that was still fresh in everybody's mind, and all these bands that came out of the mid '50s. Yes, they were kind of stretching. They were getting into extended compositions and things like that, vis-a-vis Mingus, and George Russell.
That's who I was going to ask you about, because I know you
Yeah,
studied with George, and we could get into that
yeah.
a little bit at another point. But was George Russell's those experiments, like with playing opera in 4 different keys and all of the things, some of the experimental things of George Russell, were they recorded before Ornette came on the scene, or was that after?
Yeah, no, George was already doing some very, extensive things, not completely free music. He had free moments in some of his pieces, but those RCA recordings with Hal McCusick, and O.C. Johnson, and sometimes Paul Motion was playing in that band.
Right, and then there was one with the saxophone player. What was his name? The alto player played very different too with George Russell.
Well, there's Hal McCusick.
Not Hal McCusick. He wasn't quite as well known as Hal McCusick.
Yeah, now I'm blanking on that too. But then even George was affected, I'm sure, by Ornette, and he talks about how he tried to get Ornette to join his band. He even tried to get Don Cherry to join his band, but both of them didn't want to do that because Ornette and Don wanted to continue on with their concepts in their own group.
Paul Plumley, I think,
Paul Plummer.
Paul Plummer was with
Yes.
George, right?
Yeah. That's a
Yeah.
little bit later. And
Okay.
even, when we get into George Russell with Eric Dolphy and Don Ellis, that's early 60s, 61. But George brought his own band to the School of Jazz in 1960, which included Chuck Israels, David Young, Al Kiger, and
Young was the cat I was thinking of too.
yeah, and then you had Joe Hunt, and I think that's who am I missing? Oh, and Dave Baker. So he had his own band that was like sort of group in residence, even though they were kind of considered still students at the School of Jazz. So George was still kind of he's trying to promote his own band there, and of course they recorded with that particular group. And then eventually it evolved to Eric Dolphy and Don Ellis and Paul Plummer and those guys. So yeah, there's this evolution of George Russell, a little bit pre-School of Jazz, after School of Jazz, pre-Ornette, after Ornette. Ornette, he affected Jimmy Giuffre, where Jimmy Giuffre was suddenly playing free, without any harmony or formal bar lines and anything. And then Jimmy famously ends up, graduating from the trio with Jim Hall and Bob Brookmeyer to the trio with Paul Bley and Steve Swallow, which is an amazing trio. And that period of, I don't know if you've ever heard those things,
Yeah.
but they were, extremely experimental. And it was because of Ornette that Jimmy went into this period where, this beautiful combination of those guys. Of course,
Well, there's that story so amusing in the movie, which I won't give away, about Jimmy, let's just say, playing from the floor.
Yes.
That's a funny,
Yes, because
really amusing thing.
right, he's
Oh,
kicking his legs, he's
right.
on the ground playing, all this free music because he was so affected by Ornette, and it came from this jam session that was, started with Don Cherry, sort of coaxing and challenging, Jimmy to come up here and play your ass off, man, and go free, it's just a great story, and
Well,
we found a way to thread that story.
Paul Bley challenged me years ago to do that, and I made a one free jazz record called The Night Bathers with Paul and John Abercrombie.
Wow.
And he would say, Bobby, join the avant-garde. It's where the money is.
Well, famously, Paul tells that story where Jimmy and Paul and Steve are playing at some club in New York. And, the night they made 35 cents each, they decided to disband. It was, and, 3 people were there.
That happens.
Yeah, it happens to all of us, by the
So,
way.
in other words, before we tell, I'm more
Yeah.
about the movie, which I think we've covered that, but
Yeah.
how can people finally see
these
this?
films?
What is the status right now of it ever getting out there? Both of the films. We want to talk a little bit about the other film as well,
Yeah.
the MJQ film, but I think we got a good idea of what this film is about.
Yes.
But what's the status of like getting this released?
Well, the problem was that we started with a film crew back in 2003, and I found out about these guys, by the way, just by chance, and I said, oh my God, I got to know, why are these people interested in the School of Jazz and Music Inn, more about the Music Inn than the School of Jazz at that point. And I said, oh man, maybe they should know that I know about this subject too. Well, they got me involved, and I thought I'd just do the music, but then they got me to do all the interviews. In any case, when we finally put everything together, and it took 4 or 5 years to do this film, with a small budget, we used a lot of music in the background, apropos to that period, between 1950 and 1960.
Yeah, the choice of music is great. I really like what you chose.
Well, what you heard a second version, and I had to go back and edit out all the music that was going to be really costly to us, because these are, soundtracks from Columbia Records and Sony, and you're going to have to deal with the pinhead lawyers of all these major labels, and I don't mind paying the composers and all that kind of stuff, that's fine. But when it comes to this industry thing and paying large amounts of money just to use 30 seconds of something, it really got very taxing. So I did a re-edit, and I put in music that was going to be less costly. Things that were, some of it was my dad's stuff. Some of it was never released from my dad's collection. Some of the things I found, things like that, and things that were recorded at Music Inn that never got released. In any case, we're going to still have to account for all that, and that's what's hanging me up, because it's going to cost at least maybe $50,000 to get all that cleared, and then there's going to be lawyers involved, and you're going to have to pay for that, and then where is it going to end up? We never we thought we'd have a little bit of a run. We did festivals. We decided not to do a theater run. We maybe thought about a DVD, but that kind of went by the wayside because nobody buys DVDs anymore anyway. So now all I want to do is get it on some platform, maybe Amazon Prime or Hulu or Quest or whatever. But we still have to account for those clearances. We paid for pretty much everything else, the photos that were used in that first film. The second film that I did, I just rushed to do something else, and I felt like I wanted to do something about the Modern Jazz Quartet and their role at the School of Jazz. So it's a lot more focused, but it does deal with Modern Jazz Quartet music. And, so I've got to account for that. There's some other clearances I've got to deal with. So it's all hung up because of clearances. And, I'm trying to find a way. I don't know. I don't want to cut corners necessarily, but I kind of have to. And we'll see. I'm still showing the film here and there without charging admission, and it's all free, to see these films. And I'm going to show it also at the Milan Conservatory in about a week. I'm going over there to tour. So
you can show them for free if you don't charge to.
Yeah,
people buy them.
As long as there's an educational purpose to it, and nobody's trying to make money off this. I'm not going to ever make money. I'm going to lose thousands of dollars as long as, once I get through all that clearance issue. But you still got to deal with these folks. Even a tune that's, a Gershwin tune or a Cole Porter tune.
They're not public domain.
No, of course not. You're going to have to deal with I forgot those companies, but Warner Brothers, for instance, EMI, Sony, these are places you don't want to deal with, or people you don't want to deal with in some
No
ways.
blow universe.
Yes, right.
The no blow universe.
So anyway, that's where it all stands. And I'm not giving up. The guy, the original director of the first film, he passed away a few years ago. I had to actually buy the rights from him, which I didn't mind. I felt like, that's, he was actually going through his own health issues. And that's why he went to Prague to retire there, and he passed away there. But before he left, I made a pact that I would take care of this film. It had all those interviews. It had all, 70 interviews, probably hundreds of hours, which is why I could make that MJQ film, because we just, the subject was music in, but we talk about, well, what do you think of John Lewis as the director? What do you think of Milt Jackson teaching you, vibes at that point? And how do you feel about studying with Connie Kay when you had Max Roach there? So, there was a lot of extra material that I could cull from those interviews, which are all on mini DVs. And that's how I was basically able to make this film, using all those interviews from the early 2000s. And we premiered that film. It's called From Residency to Legacy. And I premiered it in Sewanee, Tennessee, of all places, at the University.
How I love you, my dear.
At the University of the South. It's all because of Gray Smith, who was a student at the School of Jazz in 1960. And he was a vibes player, and he studied with Milt. And he was one of the main important people in that area of Tennessee who brought the Modern Jazz Quartet to Sewanee for the first time. And you can imagine in 1961, here's this all black group playing in Sewanee, and all the complications of that. But, they did it, and it was a remarkable achievement. And so there was a Modern Jazz Quartet symposium that Gray Smith had organized along with some of the folks at the University of the South. And they asked me, well, would you present something about the Modern Jazz Quartet from that first film? And I thought, well, maybe I could make something out of that first film. There's only maybe 10 minutes that highlights the Modern Jazz Quartet. And I said, well, maybe I can do a little side feature and build it up and get some other people talking about the Modern Jazz Quartet. Well, that's what I did. I dug deeply. I worked for 2 months, slaved over this thing, got it up to 65 minutes worth. which I presented with Phil Schaap there and Gary Giddens, who were guests of that particular symposium. And it was great to be with both of those guys, kind of a little bit opposites in a certain sense, but still,
You might say.
yeah, but it was great. And Phil was so beautiful to me. And they both loved the film. They particularly loved the film because I didn't use a narrator in there. It goes from story to story just through the interviews.
That's something I liked very much about it too. I thought that also there was a spontaneity. The first film, the Music Barn film, is excellent too. It's totally different, and it's a little bit like the difference between classical music and jazz.
Right.
There's almost a classical form to
Right.
the music, the Music Barn film, but there's a spontaneity to the MJQ film that I found very engaging, and I think part of that was the lack of narration, and the other part of it, when I found out that you'd done this in the short period of time that you did it in, there is that thing of necessity being the mother of invention. Just, you didn't have too much time to overanalyze it,
Right.
maybe, and so it was there's a spontaneity that's very jazz-like to it.
Yes.
And,
Yeah.
I
That's very kind of you to say that, really.
Oh, thanks. Well, it's very true. And, probably I don't have any good ideas about business, never have. But one idea, last night I turned on PBS, and a couple of weeks ago, they had this film about Max Roach,
Right.
which was really very well done. And then I turned it on last night, and there was a film called Chasing Coltrane, I think it was called. And it was a film about train. And, I thought that might be a venue, especially for the Modern Jazz Quartet film, that, you might, if you haven't already, you might check out that as a possible, it fits right in with the Max Roach and the Coltrane movies. So
where was this? Where was this again? Where were you?
On PBS, on Channel 13 in New York.
Right. Yeah, I know. PBS always seems to be a possibility of ending up getting the films shown on PBS. There's different rights with that. They still need to have everything cleared before you get to that point.
Well, I was just thinking that with the MJQ film, you might have an easier.
I might,
because some of the music too is John Lewis's, and with the connection to John Lewis's family and Sasha, and John. I know a little bit about them.
Yeah.
I thought that, gee, this might be the first one. I'm not so sure because it might be more. There's a little more standard stuff in it, but the other stuff, you can just get next to John's, John's family. Or whoever's controlling the rights to John Lewis's music.
Yeah.
I don't know. It was just a thought, but
no. That's been a name all along. By the way, I just want to mention that the film is really the way it carries is because of Percy Heath, and we were so lucky to have interviewed Percy. And he's one of the most charming human beings of all time. Everybody wanted to, Bob Brookmeyer talks about that. He said, oh man, I'd love to be like Percy Heath right at the end of the film. But, because we spent time with Percy at his house out in Montauk, he was the last of the Modern Jazz Quartet. He was, he passed a couple of years later after we interviewed him. But he really is the glue of that film. And he can talk about the Modern Jazz Quartet in first person. So we were lucky that we could.
I have a wonderful story about Percy that involved Percy and I a couple of times. The first time I really met Percy was when I was playing at New Morning in Paris. And the band was Roland Hanna, Isla Eckinger, a Swiss bass player. It was led by Miriam Klein, Swiss vocalist, but her son David on guitar, and Kenny Clark was on drums.
Wow.
So having had the privilege in my life to have toured with Kluk is one of my greatest moments in being in music. Now, my favorite rhythm section, one that I rank with any, and I don't like comparing, was the Philly Joe Red Garland rhythm section or Wynton Kelly rhythm section better than the Horace Silver, Percy Heath, Kenny Clark. That's a ridiculous conversation to me. But in terms of like which bands played with Miles, I would say for me, there's never been a better rhythm section than the rhythm section that was Percy with Kluk with Horace Silver, and the walk-in record, and of course the originals with Sonny Rollins, the one that had Erigen, Doxy, and Olio, and two takes, but not for me. You know, I cut my teeth on that. So, and Solar had that wonderful alto solo by the great Dave Schildkraut, which was a very influential record for me. You know, that and hearing Davey on Handyland were some very subtle influences and responsible, I think, for my playing. I was heavily influenced by that. Anyway, Percy came. The MJQ was not the MJQ, excuse me. The Heath Brothers band was due to start on the next night. So we were finishing our gig and they were about to start. And Jimmy, Percy, and Tootie came into the club. And it turned out that Percy sat in with us. So I got to play with 2/3 of my favorite rhythm section.
Wow.
I had Kluk and Percy together with Roland Hanna, who was doing a beautiful job. And we played Solar. And I resisted the temptation to play Dave's solo, which I didn't do. I made one up. And the groove these guys had was so beautiful. To experience this was wonderful. So I was thrilled. After the gig, my Percy and my oldest daughter's mother, Rosemary, and we were all staying in the same hotel. So Percy said, "Hey, you know, I wanted to, you know, you got any goodies and stuff?" And I said, "Yeah, I might have. I may." He said, "Hey, why don't you guys come up to my room? We can hang, we can talk." So, you know, we opened a bottle of wine and started hanging out and talking. And he talked, you know, we talked till the sun came up. He told me stories. He said to me, you know, as far as I'm concerned, nobody ever played the saxophone better, including Charlie Parker, than Sonny Rollins in 1957. And he was talking about that and talking about, you know, all the beauty of that stuff. And it was great. Now, the next time I saw Percy, I'd seen him a little bit at the IAG convention, and we'd always been friendly, you know, had a glass of wine together. But now I did this thing called the Alto Summit in Paris, and I think it was 1990, 1989, can't remember, but it was 6 altos with Jackie McLean, Phil Woods, C Sharp, who I got over there, Clarence Sharp, Vincent Herring, and Frank Morgan, and myself. And the rhythm section was Walter Davis Jr., Percy, and Roy Haynes. So in the afternoon, we had this rehearsal, and we all had features because we didn't play 6 altos the whole concert. We did 3 tunes with the 6 altos, and everybody else had a feature. Some were quintet, some were quartet. My feature was Embraceable You. So we had rehearsed it and run it down in the afternoon. And I told him there were a couple of turnarounds in there that I liked because I used to play with Duke Jordan, and I knew what he played for Bird. You know what I mean? Those were the changes because Percy was very specific. He said, anything you particularly like? I said, well, sometimes I like to do a little half Nelson turnaround, blah, blah, you know, in this place. And we went into detail, but it wasn't, he got it in a second. There was no problem. I think he sensed I was nervous because I felt a little bit nervous. I didn't think I was acting particularly nervous, but he was such an empathetic person. C Sharp and I were sharing a dressing room, and Roy Haynes and Percy were sharing a dressing room. Percy knocks on my dressing room door while Frank Morgan is doing the string part of the concert. And then the next thing is going to be us. And Percy said, man, you know, those changes that you showed me this afternoon to Embraceable You want to go over to my dressing room for a minute and I can check them, make sure I got the right stuff that you want me to play. Now, I knew that he knew those changes. We didn't need to get together for him. He wanted me to cool out and warm up a little bit by playing on a tune. He felt I would play my best if we did that.
That's beautiful.
So we played 20 minutes together with Percy and Roy Haynes playing on a magazine or on the table counter with brushes. and we did 15 minutes of Embraceable You, and came out and we played it, and I got a standing ovation. And people said, other than Dizzy, I got maybe the largest ovation of the festival the entire 2 days. And that was because Percy just sensed that I might be a little nervous and he wanted me to be relaxed and feel good. And so just at feeling him before the concert, hearing that sound, and, it was
Sure,
great.
sure. Yeah. It was,
So,
he had a beautiful sound and beautiful time. And in the movie we have this one segment where he kind of talks about playing with Kenny Clark and then playing with Connie Kay, and that's something that I don't know if anybody had heard that before, other than Percy telling that to, all his colleagues and whoever. But
yeah, well,
to capture that, moment where he talks about that, that was something I felt was important to showcase. Um,
yeah,
so
well, I mean, to me, Percy was kind of the anti Ray Brown.
mm,
There was a humility about Percy, and that reflected in his playing, that he never guerrillaed the situation. He was so present and so there,
yeah,
and yet uh, never dictating the direction. Ray Brown was a great bass player, and I got to play with him too a little bit. And as great as he was, he did it his way.
yeah, right.
You know what I mean? There was that feeling, this is where it's going, and I I personally responded better to Percy, though it was a ball to play with both of them. But
Right, right, right.
our guest has been Mr. George Schuller, who has come a very long way since I first met him when he was 10 years old, and I used to play and hang out with his brother Ed, who was all of 15, and I was 18. So that was, recently, but not that recently. Um, anyway, it's been really wonderful to have you, George.
Thank you,
But
Bob. Yeah,
thank
it was
you, George.
a lot
It
of
was
fun, a
great.
lot of fun.
And have a good time in Europe. He's leaving for Austria and other places.
So
Uh,
I'll be back.
and once again, we thank you all for watching. And this has been On the Real Side. If you like us, give us a like, or whatever they do with modern times, asking for, um, you got to be liked. It sounds like Conus, right? You got to be liked. You would say something like that.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yes, so important in this world to be liked. You know, bah humbug. No, but we do want your likes because it keeps us going. And once again, thanks very much, George, and thank you all for watching. Bye bye, and God bless you all. Let's pray for peace.